Partisans of error. Tonight, we will be presenting the modernist theology, if you could call it that. You have to bear with me because some of it is quite confusing, but we'll get through it. The sad story of the Reverend George Tyrrell and the modernist mission. The modernists have specific goals. There are proximate goals, and then it's the ultimate goal. So, we have described modernism as the most dangerous of all heresies because it destroys any basis for belief in the supernatural. It directly attacks the reality of the transcendent God. Remember, we talked about the difference between transcendent, the God that is above, the God is separate from the universe, and the God that is immanent, according to the modernists. A divine being above and in no way dependent upon all he created. Present to and holding in existence all that he created, but not identified with it. Modernism proposes a form of pantheism, as we've said. Everything is divine. It is defined by a principle of good and a principle of evil. It attempts to assimilate these errors with the teachings of Christ. It's a pre-Christian heresy, but it surfaced again after the time of Christ, and we said we make mention of several of the heresies that it allied itself with, Manichaeism, Albigensianism, and the like. These errors are obviously opposed to the doctrines of the Catholic Church. So to be a disciple of Christ has always presupposed faith in his teaching, accepting the truths that the second person of the Blessed Trinity revealed to us. The basis for believing what is divinely revealed is no less than the authority of God himself. God became man. The teachings of the incarnate Word, incarnate God, are true. How are we to know what has been taught by Christ? That's a good question. He established the church to perpetuate the truth. And St. Paul, in his letter to Timothy, calls the church the pillar and the ground of truth, the house of the living God. Very beautiful descriptions there by St. Paul's letter to Timothy. By a dogma, we mean a truth immediately revealed by God, which has been proposed to us by the teaching authority of the church to be believed as such. Let's take a look at that again. A truth immediately revealed by God, that is, directly by God to us, that has been proposed to us, not by way of suggesting, but by teaching us by the authority that he's established, the teaching authority of the church, to be believed as such, to be believed as what has been revealed. That's what we mean by dogma. That's how we derive our faith, from the deposit of faith. What a man must believe and how he must act, how he must behave, demands submission to an authority other than himself. Now, the Renaissance, I brought in some different thinking on the subject. It changed the direction of thought here. From a theocentrism, a God-centered thinking, to a humanistic ideology that placed man as its exclusive center. According to Professor Thomas Molnar in his book, Christian Humanism, quoted by Davies, Molnar, incidentally, was of Hungarian extraction. He came to the United States to teach. He had various positions in the universities in this country, Brooklyn College, Long Island University, visiting professor at Yale and other places in Europe. So he was a well-established scholar of Catholic origin. Also, he was a founding member of the first board of trustees for the Una Voce America. So he had a lot going for him. Here's what he says. Man's self-exaltation, quote, assumes that man is the master of his destiny. And if he is not master in the present conditions, he must do everything to remove the obstacles and assert himself. This leads to the gradual abolition of all that had been held valid before, so that the new man emerges as really the first man. Michael Davies, we're referring now again to that book that he wrote in 1983, Partisans of Error, quotes Louis Soleron in his book, The Nouvelle Messe, or the New Mass of 1970. What modernism means is, quote, the progressive substitution of the cult of man, cult meaning worship, for the cult of God. We adore the God who proceeds from ourselves. Soleron goes on to say, between the humanism of science and Marxism and that of the neo-Christians, whose prophet is Teilhard de Chardin, there is little or no difference. Thus, man himself in the future will be the sole Lord of the universe under his own name or that of God. Now, there's a rather pathetic side to this whole monstrous error. Humanity has been honored by divinity. We honor the second person of the Blessed Trinity in the Incarnation. And in a sense, he has divinized us by our participation in his life, beginning with being born again by baptism and the infusion of sanctifying grace. He has brought us into a deeper, closer relationship to him, and in a sense, he has divinized us. This dethroning of God and replacing him with man is Satan's way of spreading his primeval revolt. Sooner or later, man will discover the reality that he is not the sole Lord of the universe, even though he may think he is, that in fact he is subject to a tyranny, the tyranny of Lucifer. So, humanism that we have described here produces rationalism. Man making his own reason the ultimate arbiter of what he will or he will not believe. 16th century Protestantism adopted rationalism as its own. Protestantism, as you know, rejected the authority of the church, the divine teaching authority established by Christ, and put in its place private interpretation of the Bible. The new authority, private interpretation, is human reason, deciding how or what to believe. Without intending to do so, the so-called reformers had adopted rationalism. It wasn't long before rationalism, by way of liberal Protestantism, destroyed the very foundation of Protestantism. It attacked sacred scripture, Bible alone. Well, it's going to be taken away by liberal Protestantism. Under the scrutiny of rationalistic criticism, sometimes called higher criticism, the entire Bible, book by book, was rejected as mythology. John Henry Cardinal Newman fought constantly against this liberalism, even while he was an Anglican. It's probably one of the reasons why he eventually came into the church. And contrary to the spirit of tolerance of his age, and of course now ours, Newman was a staunch advocate of doctrinal intolerance. If it's true, it's true. Davies also quotes Cardinal Manning, who wrote in 1877. Manning, incidentally, was the second Archbishop of Westminster, who died in 1892. In 1877, he wrote this one little passage. The rationalists of today in Germany are legitimate sons of the Lutherans of 300 years ago, establishing again this direct connection you can't deny that Protestantism begets is a part of rationalism. Rationalism masquerading as Catholicism is modernism, just another name of the same species. Because it is based on rationalism, modernism claims one of their missions to be the necessity of reconciling science and faith, as if they have to be reconciled, as if they are not compatible. This is a false dichotomy. True science and true faith are from the same source. They're from God. And any honest scientist acknowledging the Creator will come to the conclusions that are correct. He'll discover the beauties, the wonders, the richness of this creation, and he'll acknowledge the source, God, not some random force that all of a sudden put these things together. Now, a young Jesuit by the name of George Tyrrell became enamored of this modernist mission to reconcile science and faith. And eventually, he was thoroughly indoctrinated in progressive ideology. His contribution to modernism is largely derivative, says Michael Davies, and that means it was received rather than originated from. He received it from the continental or the European modernists. But as a pioneer of the movement and after death as a hero for those working for revolutionary changes in the church, Tyrrell plays a key role in the story of modernism. George Tyrrell was born in 1861 in Ireland of Protestant parents. A good early influence in his life came from a very unexpected source. His family had hired a housemaid who was an Irish girl, Anne Kelly, who was a very strong Catholic. And to Anne Kelly's credit, she didn't have much of an education, but she knew her faith. And so whenever Mrs. Tyrrell would challenge the papist in her house, Anne Kelly would fire right back at her with the right answers. And this really impressed the young George Tyrrell. Tyrrell moved eventually to England and soon after converted to the Catholic faith in 1879. He's probably about 18 years old. Not long after, he joined the Society of Jesus. Unfortunately, obedience evidently was not one of his favorite virtues, and he had trouble adapting to the religious life. He was almost dismissed before vows, but he persevered and somehow was ordained in 1891. Now, I'm just going to suggest a book here. In addition to what we're using here from Michael Davies, you would want to, if you want to really study this in more depth, go to Malachi Martin's The Jesuits. He has an entire chapter about, the modernist cause here, and specifically Tyrrell. So he was ordained in 1891, and he taught philosophy to young Jesuits in formation at Stonyhurst College from 1894 to 1896. That's a very important position, to be training future priests. Doubts, however, arose about his comprehension of Catholic theology and philosophy. His conversion, no doubt, had been sincere, but perhaps there was some catechesis lacking because he didn't have all the answers. So he and his superiors agreed he was better suited to an active rather than an academic life. And he was assigned to the Jesuit church in residence on Farm Street in London. Tyrrell began to write articles for the English Jesuit periodical The Month. His modernist views caught the attention of a man by the name of Friedrich Hegel. Friedrich von Hegel, born in 1852 and died in 1925, was a philosopher, theologian, and writer of sorts. He lived in London, but he was, I guess you could best describe him as an amateur philosopher and theologian who personally knew and frequently visited modernists throughout Europe. So he gets Tyrrell in contact with like-minded modernists in 1897. And he encouraged the young priest to study German so he could read the writings of contemporary German philosophers. Under the influence of the European modernists, Tyrrell began to disagree with his Jesuit superiors and with Rome's official policies concerning modernists, the censures that were being placed on those who were espousing these doctrines. And for good reason, he was upset because he himself was holding the same views. He was among those who disagreed with the declaration of the papal infallibility at the First Vatican Council, which was held from 1869 to 1870. And all this he regarded as backward, medieval, defensive authoritarianism. Tyrrell had become an admirer of higher criticism that we just described a moment ago, liberal Protestantism's attacks on the Bible. Nothing could be admitted to be of divine revelation unless it could square with rationalism or reason. So that's the end of divine revelation. He favored absolute freedom for science, not fixed dogma. He cautiously introduced his ideas in a series of articles, and his purpose was specific. He wasn't stating it clearly, but he was saying the Catholic Church has to be reformed, it has to be modernized, we have to bring the church up to date. And how to do that was also in the modernist bag of tricks. As his profession of modernism became more obvious, his Jesuit superiors warned him that his opinions were bordering on heresy. In fact, they were heretical. He escaped condemnation and persisted in disseminating his errors, sometimes under pseudonyms. Also, when questioned by authorities, he didn't hesitate to use equivocation, so giving ambiguous answers with double meaning, that is, to those who were questioning him. In 1906, the controversy came to a head. The Jesuit general formally required Tyrrell to retract his errors. He refused to do so, and he was expelled from the Jesuits. In rejecting the church's teaching and not being willing to renounce his errors, he had, in fact, incurred upon himself ipso facto excommunication. Okay, so it was a formal request, and he had denied that. So in 1907, this was made public. He also went ahead and attacked the encyclical Pascendi. Now, the Catholic Church is far superior to, excuse me. Skip the page here. Don't want to do that. There we go. Tyrrell's friend, the French priest Henri Bremond, dismissed the excommunication as inconsequential, a mere Roman formalism, and of no eternal consequence. Archbishop Peter Amigo of Southwark carried on extensive correspondence with Father Tyrrell, attempting to bring him back to sound doctrine, but to no avail. The Jesuit superiors tried to keep the matter from gaining too much publicity to avoid scandal. Tyrrell continued to publish and to lecture until his early and unexpected death of Bright's disease, that's a kidney disorder, in 1909 at the age of 48. Among his final words, a firm refusal to retract his errors was stated. Tyrrell was consequently denied last rites and a Catholic burial. The Modernists were very disappointed because they thought if he could be given a Catholic burial, then it would appear that any Modernist could be counted as a Catholic in good standing. But that wasn't the case back in 1906. He was buried in the Anglican churchyard in Sturrington, Sussex. Father Henry Bremond, let's see, Faith Exodus Church, okay, let's see, Bremond's eulogy here. At the burial, Bremond went out of his way to give public praise to Tyrrell. Quote, "We knew the pathetic struggle which seemed at times to absorb his activities, and we knew too, without the slightest hesitation, what would be the end of the struggle, his conflict with Rome. We knew that for him, the Roman Catholic Church was, as a fact, stood for the oldest and the widest body of corporate Christian experience. For the closest approximation so far attained to the still far distant idea of a Catholic Church. Bremont was suspended for his participation in this rite here. The eulogy captures Tyrrell's almost schizophrenic attitude to the Church. The Church in this eulogy is described as the superior to any other religion or any other philosophical system. It's the oldest, the widest body of corporate Christian experience, and the closest approximation of the perfect church to come. This is modernism in its essence right here. The closest we're going to get to the still distant idea of a Catholic Church. Several points worth noting here. Christ established the church, and so it is a divine institution. Yes, granted, it has human elements that have their limitations and their weaknesses. Nevertheless, it remains a divine institution with the promise of indefectibility. It will remain the Church of Christ to the end. It is not an approximation of something better to come in this world. Christ has established the church that will perdure into the end of time, and then there will be a new church. It will be the new Jerusalem for all eternity. That's the ultimate goal of the church, but not a new church in time. Also of significance is the belief that the church is the widest body of corporate Christian experience. Does that suggest the possibility of non-corporate Christian experience? It certainly does. And this is right where we're heading for. The new universal church will not be limited to incorporation by baptism, faith, obedience, profession of these. Here we see the importance today of ecumenism, depending upon, this is what the modernists were advocating from the very beginning. According to Tyrrell, the obstacle preventing the emergence of the new future church is, quote, the entrenched church bureaucracy, corrupted by power, suspicious of scholarship, fearful of innovation, terrified of losing its grip on the minds of the faithful it exploited. A little bit of rancor there, don't you think? Not just heresy, but just some bitterness. Let's see this now. The church is all about control, according to Tyrrell. And of course, his perception of control is defined, no doubt, by his confrontation with authority when he was out of control. His gratuitous remarks about scholarship and innovation will be issues of great importance as modernism gains ascendancy in the church. Okay, the church isn't against scholarship. The church created the universities of Europe. The church is against false scholarship, errors, and has the right to monitor what's being taught for the benefit of the faithful. How about innovation? Can we admit of any innovation? Does the deposit of faith change from year to year? Are we passing on different beliefs from generation to generation? No, these is all spurious arguments here from the modernists. The church, he maintained, is but a phase in a historical science of religion. Here's that science again. Okay. The science of religion would, in some sense, he said, be a science of Catholicism, of a microcosm in which the whole religious process of the world is represented. This is in his book, posthumously published, Christianity at the Crossroads. So that this idea of this future religion, it will have elements of Catholicism, but only because Catholicism contributed as part of an important, integral part of the passing phase of world religion. Therefore, the modernists should have no intention of leaving the church. While the old Roman bureaucracy and the papacy do everything to prop up a crumbling church, the modernists must do their part to hasten the new day. This is why Tyrrell, and fellow modernists of his time are regarded as heroes by the enemies of Catholic tradition. For deeper insight into this important topic, again, I refer you to Malachi Martin's The Jesuits. According to Tyrrell, Christ recalled man to inwardness. That's true in a very, very real sense, but as always, these things can be taken two ways. The inwardness, which Christ is talking about, is the manifestation and the realization of God's presence within us. But according to Tyrrell and the modernists, it's that Christ didn't establish a visible church. It's all within, immanentism. After the apostolic age, a number of loosely federated communities of believers, directly democratic, were authorized by the Holy Spirit to teach what was to be believed. This is derived directly from Protestantism. Okay, faith communities. Right? There was no real hierarchy. Okay, even though our Lord did say to Peter, "I'll give you the key to the kingdom of heaven. Feed my lambs, feed my sheep." All that is now disregarded as, inconsequential. What really happened, according to the modernists, was that these faith communities were established. It was very democratic. In other words, we're going to believe what everyone believes, and we'll take a vote on it. All right? And this is exactly what the modernists wanted and are pushing for. Eventually, a highly centralized ecclesiastical empire, pope, bishops, priests, displaced the original communities of believers. The deposit of faith was confided originally to the people. Therefore, we are a church of the people, according to the Jesuits, according to the Jesuit modernists. Actually, same thing. All right. So the church has to be democratic, and the people are the Pope, the Vicar of Christ. To be Catholic is to believe in the, quote, historical Catholic community as the living outgrowth of the apostolic mission. The Catholic community as the living outgrowth of the apostolic mission. Never mind the church, never mind the sacraments, never mind the hierarchy, it's the people. So, with each passing age, men invent formulas that reflect only one stage in the growth of the Spirit in humanity. We get this all the time. We quote Innocent III or Boniface the Old. Well, that was back then. Yeah, it was back then. And the gospel was back then even farther, okay? But it's the truth. No, not according to the modernists. Belief itself, therefore, has to change. This is the true religious process. There's no dogma for our permanent assent. We have been simply given a way of life. Church dogmas have no more authority than formulas of scientists. They all change because they all progress, just as humanity is progressing. The Roman Catholic Church was an experiment. Okay, church as experiment. Necessary at the beginning to keep the memories of Christ alive, but those days are over. Now, there might be some hope. The Pope, the bishops, should be the voice of the feelings and beliefs of the faithful, but in reality, the Roman hierarchy is outlived its usefulness. The hierarchy, according to the modernists, now represents a perversion of what was once promised of a good institution, organization for humanity. So the church needs to re-enter the religious process of humanity to offer her spiritual service to civilization. It could do this by renouncing its claim to divine origin, its claim to divine origin of immutable doctrines, its fixed government or hierarchy. Where is this religious process of humanity headed? Well, ultimately, explains Tyrrell, to the, quote, Catholic ideal of an international and universal religion inspired by the idea of democracy as the original constitution of the church, end quote. Sound familiar? The Roman Catholic Church must conform to the laws of inevitable process. Tyrrell suggests that the Catholic Church might have to die and then order to live again in greater and grander form. And he says this will most likely be necessary because ecclesiastical authority continues in their intransigent rejection of the light of man's new discoveries in religion and in sciences. So, some of the main points that we need to take with us from our study of modernism by way of a summary here. The modernists of the 19th and 20th centuries forged a system of disbelief and belief based on the errors of Gnosticism, liberal Protestantism, and rationalism. The original modernists claimed they were called to a mission. There is an evolving universe, and therefore an evolving humanity is a necessary element of that. And as we have it presented to us today, there are various levels of this modernist indoctrination. Next, moreover, to attain the ultimate goals of this evolutionary process, both cosmic and personal or individual, demands constant change. The necessary change advances only insofar as what is outdated and useless is torn down and replaced with what is new. We're living in this description here. Further, these changes are not optional. They are inevitable. So, in other words, if you're not on board, get off the tracks because you're going to get run over. Pretty much is what they're saying. Get out of the way. Here we come. So we have seen the results of this thinking in the church today. An intensification of these beliefs and these attitudes for the last 50 years or more, in various degrees of acceptance or rejection, but nevertheless present to us. There are other Tyrrells flourishing in our day. We don't always see modernism as raw Tyrrellism, but its effects are everywhere. A couple of them in brief summary. So-called Catholic education, including seminaries, have been teaching this for decades. Higher criticism has sown doubt and denial. A whole generation, I say my generation, was infected with all of these ideas in high school and in college. And I haven't kept in touch with too many of the young people that I grew up with, but I know that the ones who I do know lost the faith. It was gone, just taken away from them in their schools, Catholic schools. The very foundations of the supernatural are challenged with impunity. What Tyrrell was censored for is now being honored. Individual sectors of the clergy and hierarchy are infected with these errors. So, lastly, what is our response? Well, let's recall the divine providence, the divine promise. Humanly speaking, it would seem unlikely that modernism could be displaced. It's so well entrenched, it's everywhere. These errors were seeping into the church 150 years ago and were stopped by the authoritative teaching of the church, but like a cancerous tumor that is not completely eradicated or cured, the cancer continued to exist and eventually began to spread. Lest we lose sight of the divine promise, I am with you all days, even to the consummation of the world. The gates of hell shall not prevail. We need to renew our faith in the power and the providential care of God. Mere speculation on what is happening in the church today or what will happen next often leads to contention and division within the ranks of orthodoxy, and it serves no purpose. We need to remain healthy cells in the mystical body of Christ. And insofar as we are able, we need to mitigate in our own sphere of influence the effects and the causes of this disease. We have to become vibrant cells of orthodoxy and tradition, which requires prayer, sacrifice, study, and in any way we can to keep the faith. And lastly, to support those movements in the church working for its restoration.